The betrayal across the street, a shocking tale of deceit. The early morning light filtered through the blinds, casting gentle shadows across the living room. It was one of those perfect, quiet mornings that seemed to slow time itself. The world outside was still and calm. Daniel sat at the kitchen table, sipping his coffee, as he listened to the soft hum of the coffee machine. His wife, Nancy, was at the stove, cooking breakfast with a smile that made his heart feel light. They were the picture of a perfect couple, young, successful, and with everything seemingly in place. They had a lovely home in a quiet suburban neighborhood, the kind of place where neighbors waved at each other and everyone knew each other's business. It wasn't just the house they had built together, it was their life. Everything felt right. Nancy set the plate of eggs and toast down in front of Daniel and kissed him on the cheek. "Good morning, love," she said softly, her voice warm and tender. Daniel smiled back, taking her hand and squeezing it gently. There was nothing unusual about this moment. It was just another perfect morning in a life that seemed to be as flawless as the neighborhood they lived in. Nancy was beautiful, her smile could light up a room, and her laughter was infectious. Daniel had met her 5 years ago at a mutual friend's party, and from the moment he saw her, he knew she was the one. It wasn't long before they were married. Their connection was effortless, comfortable. They balanced each other perfectly. Daniel, reserved and thoughtful, and Nancy, spontaneous and full of energy. Together, they made sense. They completed each other. But even in this picture-perfect life, there was always a little room for doubt. Daniel had heard the rumors that sometimes floated through the neighborhood, nothing malicious, just idle gossip about how close Nancy had become with Jason, their new neighbor. Jason was a tall, good-looking guy in his early 30s, with a charming smile that seemed to melt everyone's defenses. He had moved into the house next door 6 months ago, and ever since, he had been a regular fixture in Daniel and Nancy's lives. Jason was helpful. He'd offered to mow their lawn, fix Daniel's car when it broke down, and even brought over a few beers on a lazy Sunday afternoon. He was the perfect neighbor. In fact, he was so perfect that Daniel had started to see him as a friend. He never thought twice about Jason being at their house. After all, he was just a neighbor, a guy who helped out. But something in the back of his mind nagged him now and then. Just little things. The way Jason would linger a bit longer than necessary during visits. The way Nancy would laugh a little too loudly at his jokes. But Daniel had pushed those thoughts away, convincing himself that they were just harmless interactions. That morning, as Nancy leaned over to kiss him goodbye before he left for work, Daniel thought about those tiny doubts. But in the warmth of the moment, they seemed so small, so insignificant. "I love you," Nancy said, her eyes sparkling. "Have a great day at work." "I love you too," Daniel replied, his heart swelling with affection. He kissed her once more, grabbed his bag, and walked out the door. It was just another normal day. Or so he thought. As Daniel got into his car and drove off to work, the neighborhood looked as peaceful as ever. The sun was rising, birds were singing, and everything seemed right in the world. Little did he know, his life was about to be turned upside down. The first crack in his perfect life was about to appear. He couldn't see it coming, but it was already there, just around the corner. The day at work was typical, nothing extraordinary, nothing out of the ordinary. Daniel found comfort in the predictability of his job, the routine of his tasks, and the rhythm of office life. It was a small escape from the discomfort brewing in his mind, something he couldn't quite place but couldn't shake either. Throughout the day, a nagging feeling tugged at him, one that wasn't about work or anything that could be solved with a few phone calls. It was something deeper, something personal, like an unease that had silently grown over the past few days. By the time he left the office, Daniel's thoughts were still on Nancy and Jason. It wasn't that he suspected anything overtly, rather, it was a feeling, a whisper of doubt that had been there for a while but was now growing louder. He tried to push it out of his mind, convincing himself it was just his imagination running wild. As he drove back toward home, the sun setting on the horizon painted the sky in hues of orange and pink, a stark contrast to the cold not forming in Daniel's stomach. When he approached the street that led to his house, something caught his eye. A delivery truck was parked in front of his house, the large vehicle blocking part of the driveway. The truck wasn't anything unusual. He knew the delivery service that ran through the neighborhood, but it felt out of place today. Daniel slowed his car as he neared the house, his attention shifting to the truck's driver. The man was walking up the driveway, heading towards the front door. He seemed to be taking an unusually long time to reach the door, as if he were waiting for something or perhaps watching something through the window. Daniel couldn't shake the strange feeling that the man was more interested in his house than he should have been. But there was no reason for concern. Maybe it was just a coincidence, Daniel thought. Maybe the delivery had nothing to do with him and everything to do with the logistics of the day. However, Daniel's curiosity was piqued, and something told him that it wasn't just a normal delivery. He parked his car and got out, but before he could head inside, he noticed the delivery driver staring toward him. The man quickly turned his head and started walking back toward the truck, avoiding eye contact. It was a strange interaction, one that left Daniel with a growing sense of discomfort. As he walked into the house, Daniel brushed off the feeling, reasoning that it was nothing more than an odd coincidence. Nancy was in the kitchen, as usual, preparing dinner. The moment he stepped in, she flashed him a smile, the warmth of her presence instantly calming his nerves. "Hey, how was your day?" she asked, her voice smooth and familiar. "Same as usual," Daniel replied, forcing a smile. But even as the words left his mouth, the nagging feeling didn't subside. There was something there, something not quite right. Later that evening, after dinner, Daniel was alone in his office when he received an unexpected knock on the door. It was Frank, the delivery driver from earlier. His presence caught Daniel off guard. Frank stood there with a sheepish expression, as if he weren't sure whether he should be there at all. Mr. Daniels?" Frank began, his voice hesitant. "I'm really sorry to bother you, but I've been thinking about something. I just wanted to let you know that I noticed something earlier today, and I think you should know about it." Daniel's brow furrowed. "What do you mean?" "I'm not trying to get involved or anything, but I saw your wife and the guy next door, Jason, at your house today," Frank said, avoiding direct eye contact. "They were inside, alone, and, well, they weren't just talking." "I'm sorry if I'm out of line, but it didn't sit right with me." Daniel's heart skipped a beat, his body going stiff as Frank's words sunk in. His mind raced, spinning with confusion, disbelief, and, now, an undeniable sense of dread. "Are you sure?" Daniel managed to say, struggling to hold himself together. "They were just inside, talking?" Frank hesitated, his face flushing. "I'm not sure what I saw, but it seemed off. They were too close, you know? Too friendly. I didn't want to say anything, but I thought you should know." Daniel stood frozen, the weight of Frank's words sinking in. He felt as though the room had suddenly closed in on him. The world seemed distant, as if everything around him had blurred. Jason and Nancy? Inside his house? Alone? "Thanks, Frank," Daniel said quietly, his voice shaky but composed. "I appreciate you letting me know." As Frank walked away, Daniel sat down at his desk, staring at the wall in front of him. He wasn't sure what to think, but the words replayed in his mind like an echo: Nancy and Jason, alone in the house. It was like a slow burn starting deep in his chest, and the more he tried to push it away, the more it took hold. He tried to reason with himself. Maybe Frank was wrong. Maybe he had misinterpreted something. But a nagging thought began to rise: what if Frank was telling the truth? What if Nancy and Jason were more than just neighbors? It was a thought Daniel wasn't ready to face, but he couldn't deny the growing suspicion that something was terribly wrong. And he was about to find out just how deep the betrayal went. The night felt long. Daniel couldn't seem to find the peace he usually had when he came home from work. His mind was running at a mile a minute, playing and replaying Frank's words over and over again in his head. Nancy and Jason, inside the house, alone. The images were jarring, making his stomach churn. What did that even mean? Was it a harmless visit, or was something far darker unfolding right under his nose? His thoughts kept returning to the way Frank described it, too close, and the more Daniel thought about it, the more he realized how strange the whole thing seemed. Nancy had never been the type to let people linger around her for too long. She was friendly, yes, but not in a way that would ever make him feel uncomfortable. And yet, in the back of his mind, doubts began to creep in, tying together small things he had noticed over the past few weeks. There was that evening when Nancy had seemed unusually distracted. She had stayed late at work, not because she had to, but because she said she wanted to clear some things up. Or when Jason had dropped by last Sunday with a bottle of wine, and she'd made sure to make him feel welcome, perhaps a bit too welcome for Daniel's liking. Was it all innocent? But even as these thoughts flooded his mind, Daniel wasn't ready to believe it. He couldn't. Nancy had always been his anchor. She had been the one constant in his life, the person he could rely on. And yet now, her loyalty was being questioned in a way that felt impossible to swallow. The next morning, Daniel made a decision. He couldn't go on living in the shadow of doubt, letting the suspicion gnaw at him. He had to know the truth. He had to confront Nancy, and he needed to do it in a way that wasn't tainted by the emotions he was feeling. As Daniel left for work that day, he felt an unsettling calm. It wasn't peace, exactly, but more like a dull resignation to what was coming. He hadn't spoken to Nancy about the previous night's conversation with Frank, and she hadn't brought it up either. The house felt too still, too quiet. But today, something inside him demanded answers. Today, the truth would come to light. As the hours ticked by at the office, Daniel found himself becoming more and more impatient. Every minute that passed seemed to stretch longer than the last. By the time the afternoon rolled around, he couldn't stand it any longer. He left work early, telling his boss that he had an urgent matter to attend to at home. He needed to confront Nancy now. The drive home felt like an eternity. Each red light, each turn, seemed to drag him further into the pit of his growing anxiety. His heart raced with anticipation, dread, and a quiet hope that it wasn't true. He tried to prepare himself for the worst, tried to convince himself that he might find nothing. But a tiny voice inside him kept whispering, "What if it's true?" When Daniel pulled into the driveway, he saw nothing unusual. The house was quiet. Nancy's car was parked in its usual spot, and there were no signs of Jason. The sense of unease didn't dissipate, but it didn't overwhelm him either. He took a deep breath and walked toward the front door, trying to steady his nerves. As he entered the house, the smell of dinner being cooked wafted through the air. Nancy was in the kitchen, humming softly to herself as she stirred a pot on the stove. She looked up and smiled when she saw him, but Daniel's gaze didn't soften. "Hey, what's up?" she asked, wiping her hands on a dish towel. "You're home early." He took a deep breath, standing in the doorway between the kitchen and living room. "We need to talk," he said, his voice more serious than he had intended. Nancy's smile faltered, and she set the dish towel down, concern flashing in her eyes. "Okay, what's going on?" Daniel walked into the kitchen, standing a few feet away from her. He could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on him, but he couldn't let it go any longer. His chest tightened. "I need you to be honest with me, Nancy. Were you and Jason," he paused, swallowing the lump in his throat, "were you two alone here yesterday?" Nancy's expression shifted almost imperceptibly, a flicker of something unreadable crossing her face before she recovered. "What are you talking about?" she asked, though there was an edge to her voice now, a hint of defensiveness. "Frank told me he saw you too," Daniel continued, his voice steady but sharp. "He said you were inside, alone. He said it looked off. So, I need to know what happened." Nancy's face paled, and for a moment, neither of them spoke. The silence stretched out between them, heavy and thick. It was in that moment that Daniel realized just how far his trust in her had been shaken. What he saw in her eyes wasn't guilt or surprise, it was something else entirely. Something that made his stomach twist. Daniel, it's not what you think," Nancy said softly, her hands trembling slightly as she spoke. "I never wanted you to find out like this. But, yes. We were alone. But it wasn't what you're thinking. I swear." Daniel's heart sank. "Not what I'm thinking." How could it not be what he was thinking? What other explanation was there? His mind raced, searching for some kind of explanation, something that could make sense of this. "Nancy," Daniel's voice was quiet now, shaking with the force of his own emotions. please. Tell me the truth. The room seemed to hold its breath, waiting for Nancy's response. And then, with a deep sigh, she sat down at the kitchen table and looked up at him, her eyes filled with a mixture of sorrow and guilt. I never meant for it to happen, she whispered, her voice breaking. But Jason and we've been seeing each other for a while. I'm sorry, Daniel. I never wanted to hurt you. I didn't know how to stop. The words hit Daniel like a punch to the gut. His vision blurred, and for a moment, he thought he might collapse. The woman he loved, the woman who had always been his everything, had betrayed him in the worst way possible. His heart shattered in that moment, and the reality of the situation began to settle like cold stones in his chest. Daniel felt the room spinning around him as Nancy's words reverberated through his mind. We've been seeing each other for a while, she had said, as if the casual tone of the confession could somehow soften the blow. But there was no comfort in her words, only betrayal. His whole world, everything he thought he knew, felt like it was crumbling around him. For a long moment, Daniel couldn't speak. The words he wanted to say, the anger and confusion that were swelling inside of him, felt like they were trapped somewhere deep, or they couldn't escape. He felt a coldness spreading through him, numbing him to everything else around him. He had known something was off, but this? This was something he never could have prepared for. Nancy's face was pale, her hands trembling in her lap. She was clearly distraught, but there was no way Daniel could find any sympathy for her right now. His mind couldn't process the idea of what she had just confessed, the image of her with Jason playing on an endless loop in his head. He struggled to find his voice, but when it finally came, it was a hoarse whisper. How long? His throat tightened, and he forced the words out. How long has this been going on? Nancy's eyes filled with tears as she looked down at the table, unable to meet his gaze. A few months. But Daniel, I never meant for it to happen. It just did. We became close. I didn't expect it to go this far. Her voice cracked as she spoke, as though her words had become too heavy for her to carry. Daniel stood frozen, unable to comprehend what he was hearing. How had she hidden this from him? They had built their lives together, every moment of their marriage a piece of a puzzle that now seemed shattered beyond repair. The thought of her with Jason, laughing, talking, sharing intimate moments that should have been his, it cut deeper than any physical pain. The betrayal was suffocating, and the air around him felt thick with the weight of it. So all this time, Daniel's voice grew louder now, the anger finally breaking through. You were lying to me? You were coming home, acting like everything was normal while you were seeing him? He couldn't stop the bitterness that leaked into his voice. It was a raw, guttural reaction to a wound that was too fresh to ignore. Nancy's face crumpled in anguish, her hands clutching the edge of the table as if she needed something to hold on to. I didn't want to hurt you, Daniel. I swear. I thought about ending it, but I couldn't. I was confused. Jason, he made me feel something I hadn't felt in a long time. Her voice broke, and she choked back a sob. But you're my husband. I love you. I always have. Daniel's chest tightened at the sound of those words, but it was too late for them to mean anything now. She had betrayed him. The love they shared felt so distant now, as if it had been a different lifetime. How could she still claim to love him after everything she had done? The room felt suffocating, the silence between them stretched too thin for either of them to fill. Daniel's heart was breaking, but at the same time, it felt like the rage within him was fighting to escape. He wanted to scream. He wanted to throw something, to do anything that might release the torrent of emotions that had been building up inside him. But instead, all he could do was stand there, frozen and consumed by the realization of the woman he thought he knew, the woman he had loved, was not the person he had thought her to be. Why Jason? He asked bitterly, the question slipping from his lips before he could stop it. Why him? You didn't even try to hide it. You were bold about it. And you did it in our house, in our home. Nancy's face reddened with shame, but she didn't answer right away. She simply looked down, tears silently rolling down her cheeks. After a few moments, she spoke again, her voice barely above a whisper. I didn't know how to hide it, Daniel. It wasn't about hiding it. It was about feeling alive again. Jason made me feel wanted, exciting. I know that sounds awful, but I was lonely. I missed something, and I don't know. I made a mistake, a terrible one, and I'm sorry. I wish I could take it all back. But Daniel didn't want apologies. He didn't want words anymore. He wanted the truth, the full truth of how this had happened, and how it had gone on for so long under his nose. But most of all, he wanted the woman he had married back. The woman who had promised him forever, not the stranger sitting before him now, racked with guilt. You can't just undo this, Nancy, he finally said, his voice quieter now but still sharp with the hurt he couldn't suppress. This is something I can't forget. I don't know if I can even look at you the same way after this. Nancy stood up suddenly, stepping toward him with desperation in her eyes. Please, Daniel, don't say that. Don't give up on us. I know what I've done is unforgivable, but I want to fix this. I want to make it right. I love you. I'm begging you to forgive me. Daniel stepped back, the distance between them now feeling impossibly wide. He didn't know how to respond, didn't know what to say. His heart was broken, but at the same time, a cold anger was rising within him, one that left no room for forgiveness. He needed time. He needed space to breathe, to think, to process the betrayal he had just uncovered. But most of all, he needed to protect himself from the hurt she had caused. I need you to leave, Nancy, Daniel said, his voice low and final. I need you to leave right now. Nancy's face crumpled as she opened her mouth to speak, but no words came out. She stood there, caught between wanting to fix everything and realizing that it was already too late. After a long moment, she turned and walked out of the room without another word. As the door closed behind her, Daniel was left standing there, his heart a battlefield between love and resentment. He had never felt more alone in his life. Daniel sat in the silence of his home, his mind still processing the words Nancy had spoken. The echo of her pleading, the desperation in her voice, seemed to linger in the air, but no matter how hard he tried, he couldn't find it within himself to forgive her. He didn't know if he ever could. The house felt different now, empty, even though it was the same place he had called home for years. The walls seemed to close in on him, as though they were witnessing the collapse of something that was once beautiful, once whole. Everything he had built with Nancy had been shattered, and there was no way to put it back together. He looked around the living room. The furniture was the same. The photographs on the walls still smiled back at him, frozen in time, moments of happiness, moments of love that now felt like they belonged to someone else. Someone who wasn't him. A pang of pain gripped his chest as he thought about all the moments they had shared, all the memories they had created together. How had it all become a lie? Jason. That name repeated in his head like a drumbeat. The thought of his neighbor being so close to Nancy, touching her, whispering to her, made Daniel feel nauseous. He had trusted Jason. The two had been friends for years, had shared barbecues, helped each other with home repairs, and even traded stories over drinks on the weekends. To think that his friend had been the one to betray him, to take something so sacred, twisted his stomach into knots. But as much as the betrayal stung, as much as the pain of it burned, Daniel couldn't ignore the feeling that had been creeping up within him all afternoon, a gnawing sense of finality. He was done. Done with the lies. Done with the deceit. The relationship, no matter how much he had loved Nancy, was broken beyond repair. There was no way to go back, no way to undo what had been done. The house felt too quiet, too still. Daniel tried to occupy his mind by pacing, by going through the motions of his usual routine, but nothing felt the same. Nothing felt normal. He wanted to scream, to throw something, to release the fury that was boiling inside him, but instead, he stayed silent, trapped in his own thoughts. The weight of the betrayal crushed him, and it felt like there was no escape from it. His phone buzzed, pulling him out of his spiral. He glanced down at the screen, seeing Nancy's name flashing across the display. He ignored it. Then it buzzed again, and again, each time growing more insistent. His thumb hovered over the screen, torn between picking up the call or ignoring it completely. He finally answered, his voice cold. "What do you want, Nancy?" "I'm sorry," she said, her voice breaking. I didn't mean to hurt you. I know it's too late for apologies, but please, can we talk? I don't want to lose you, Daniel. Her words hung in the air, but they felt empty. How could she ask him for forgiveness when she had already broken everything between them? How could she expect him to just forgive and forget? The idea of sitting down with her, of listening to her excuses and explanations, seemed unbearable. I don't think we can fix this, Daniel replied, his voice trembling with the pain he was trying so hard to keep at bay. You've made your choices, Nancy. And now I have to make mine. I can't keep living in this lie. There was a long pause on the other end of the line before Nancy's voice came through again, quieter this time. I understand, Daniel. I just wanted you to know that I am sorry. I never wanted to hurt you. I don't expect you to forgive me. I just wanted you to know that. The finality of her words hit him like a wave. She had already given up. And so had he. There was no point in pretending anymore. No point in trying to patch up something that had been broken for far too long. I'll be moving out tonight, Nancy added, her voice soft. I thought you should know. Daniel didn't answer. He didn't need to. He heard the click of the call ending, and just like that, she was gone. It felt like a door had closed, but the silence that followed was louder than anything she could have said. He was alone now, in a house that no longer felt like a home. Hours passed, but Daniel didn't know how much time had gone by. He just sat there, lost in his thoughts, replaying everything over and over again. He felt like a fool. A fool for trusting her, for believing in the life they had built together. But most of all, he felt angry. Angry that she had stolen his peace, his trust, and his love. The sun was setting, casting long shadows across the room. As the light faded, Daniel's mind began to shift. He realized that as painful as this moment was, it was the first step toward something else. He didn't know what the future held, but he knew he couldn't stay stuck in this moment forever. He would need to move on. To rebuild. To find himself again. As the night wore on, Daniel started to think about the next steps. He didn't know if he was ready to forgive, but he knew one thing for sure: he was ready to take back control of his life. It wasn't going to be easy, and the road ahead would be long. But he would heal. He would rise above this. The door to the future, uncertain as it was, stood before him. And though it was scary, Daniel knew he had to step through it. The weeks that followed were a blur for Daniel. He had never felt more disconnected from everything and everyone. Nancy had moved out that night, just as she had said she would. Her absence in the house was overwhelming, yet oddly freeing. The silence that had once been suffocating now seemed to offer him the space to breathe, to think, to process. But it wasn't peace. Not yet. It was a fragile stillness, a quiet before the storm of emotions that was yet to come. At first, Daniel tried to keep his routine as normal as possible, going to work each day and maintaining a semblance of order. But there was no denying the weight of the loss that hung over him. Each day, he felt a little more disconnected from the world, as though the pain of what had happened had become a part of him, like a shadow that he couldn't shake. There were moments when the anger would surge at Nancy, at Jason, at himself, and he would feel a sharp stab in his chest, the hurt and betrayal fresh as if it had just happened. Other days, the sadness would creep in, overwhelming him with a sense of emptiness. He couldn't bring himself to call anyone, couldn't talk to his friends or family. The thought of explaining everything, of reliving the details, made him recoil. The more he kept it to himself, the heavier it felt. But the walls were closing in again, and he knew that sooner or later, he would have to confront the truth. He needed to move forward. He couldn't let this define him. One afternoon, after another long day at the office, Daniel found himself standing in front of the coffee shop that had become a small, unexpected refuge for him over the past few weeks. It wasn't the place he used to go to with Nancy, it wasn't filled with shared memories or routines. It was new, a place where no one knew his name and he could blend into the background. The familiar smell of espresso and the murmur of quiet conversation helped to ground him, to remind him that life was still moving forward, whether he was ready or not. He stepped inside and ordered his usual, an Americano with a splash of cream, and sat at a table near the window. He tried not to notice the couple across the room, laughing and enjoying each other's company. The sight of them only made the hole in his chest grow wider. Still, he tried to focus on the comforting ritual of drinking his coffee, letting the warmth seep into him as he stared out at the street. It wasn't until the barista called his name that Daniel snapped out of his thoughts. He stood and grabbed his cup, but as he did, his phone buzzed in his pocket. He glanced down at the screen, half expecting it to be Nancy, but instead, it was a message from Frank. "Hey, man. Just wanted to check in. You good?" Daniel stared at the message, unsure of how to respond. Frank had been the one to set everything in motion, the one who had forced him to face the truth. At first, Daniel had been angry at him for even mentioning Nancy and Jason, but now, there was a part of him that felt grateful. Frank had been the one person who hadn't backed away, who hadn't turned a blind eye. With a deep breath, Daniel typed out a response. "I'm surviving. It's been rough, but I'll get through it." He paused for a moment before adding, "Thanks for reaching out." "I'll be okay." Frank's reply came almost immediately. "You've got this, Daniel. You deserve better. Let me know if you need anything, man." Daniel read the message and felt something shift inside of him. He wasn't sure if he believed that he deserved better yet, but he knew one thing for sure: he couldn't let the pain control him. He couldn't let it define who he was. He would find a way to rebuild, to find his footing again. That night, for the first time in weeks, Daniel felt a flicker of hope. It was small, barely noticeable, but it was there. Maybe this was just the beginning. Maybe he was finally ready to start picking up the pieces. Over the next few days, Daniel took small steps toward healing. He began working out again, something he had put on hold during the chaos of the past few months. It didn't make the pain go away, but it gave him a sense of control, a way to channel his anger and frustration into something productive. He also started spending more time with his friends, though it was hard at first. He wasn't ready to open up to them, to tell them the full story of what had happened, but he enjoyed the distraction. They made him laugh, and for a few hours each week, he didn't have to think about Nancy or Jason or the wreckage of his marriage. One evening, as he was sitting at home, Daniel finally made the decision to clear out some of Nancy's things. It wasn't easy, but he knew it had to be done. He started with her clothes, folding them neatly and packing them away. Each item felt like a reminder of the life they had shared, the life he was now saying goodbye to. But there was also a strange sense of relief in the act. With each piece of clothing, each memento, he was letting go. He was letting go of the hurt, of the lies, and of the version of himself that had existed within that relationship. When the last box was packed and stored in the closet, Daniel stood in the middle of the room, staring at the empty space. For the first time, it felt like he could breathe. The room wasn't full of memories anymore, it was just a room. A blank canvas. And maybe, just maybe, that was exactly what he needed. The road ahead was still uncertain. Daniel didn't know if he was ready to date again, or if he would ever fully trust someone the way he had trusted Nancy. But he was learning to embrace the uncertainty. It was his journey, his path to walk. And with each day that passed, he was learning to stand a little taller, to carry the weight of his past with a little less burden. For the first time in months, Daniel felt the flicker of possibility. The days that followed were a slow and steady process of rebuilding, but there was something different about this stage of Daniel's life. There was a quiet strength that had begun to grow within him, a strength born not from anger or bitterness, but from the acceptance that he couldn't change what had happened. Nancy's betrayal was a scar that would remain with him, but it wasn't going to define who he was going to be moving forward. As weeks passed, Daniel felt like he was finally starting to get his life back in order. The fog of pain that had consumed him in the immediate aftermath of Nancy's departure began to lift. It wasn't perfect, and there were still days when he'd wake up with a sense of dread in his chest, but he was learning how to cope. He was learning that it was okay to not have all the answers and that healing wasn't a linear process. One afternoon, as he sat in his favorite coffee shop once more, his phone buzzed. He glanced down at the screen, expecting another message from Frank or one of his friends. But it wasn't. It was from Nancy. Daniel, I don't know where to start. I've thought about you every day since I left. I know I hurt you in ways I can never take back, but I need you to know that I'm sorry. I hope one day you'll be able to forgive me, but I understand if you can't. Please know I'll always care about you. I hope you're finding peace. Take care of yourself. Daniel stared at the message for a long time. His fingers hovered over the keys, torn between responding and leaving things as they were. He had spent so many nights replaying everything in his mind, wondering what would happen if he ever saw Nancy again or if they could ever find some semblance of peace. But he had come to realize that closure wouldn't come from her, or from any message or apology she could send. It had to come from within himself. With a steady breath, Daniel put his phone down on the table, his gaze drifting out the window. The street was alive with movement, cars passing by, people walking on the sidewalk, the world continuing its endless march forward. And in that moment, Daniel realized that he was part of that world. He wasn't defined by Nancy's betrayal. He wasn't stuck in the past. He had a future ahead of him, one that was still wide open with possibility. He didn't respond to Nancy's message, but he didn't feel anger or resentment anymore. Instead, he felt a sense of release. He had forgiven her not because she deserved it, but because he deserved peace. And as the days passed, he began to feel that peace settling inside him, like a gentle tide washing over the raw edges of his heart. One day, about a month after Nancy had moved out, Daniel was standing in front of the mirror, adjusting his tie before work, when he caught his own reflection. He looked at himself for a moment, really seeing the man who stood there. There were lines around his eyes, evidence of the sleepless nights and the emotional toll that the past months had taken. But there was something else there now, something stronger, something more resilient. He had come through the storm, and though he would carry the scars, they would never again hold him captive. At work, he found himself more focused. He was more present in meetings, more attentive to his colleagues, and his work began to reflect the clarity he was beginning to feel in his personal life. It was as if the pieces of his world were starting to come together again, even if they weren't quite the same as they had been before. And that was okay. He wasn't the same person, and that wasn't a bad thing. Daniel also found himself reconnecting with his friends in a way he hadn't in a long time. He had kept to himself for so long, afraid of what they might think or say about his broken marriage. But as time went on, he realized that his true friends didn't care about his past mistakes, they cared about his well-being. They cared about the person he was becoming. One weekend, Frank invited him out for drinks. The two of them sat at a small bar, catching up on life. Frank had been a constant presence in Daniel's life, offering support when Daniel had needed it most, and now Daniel found himself leaning into that friendship in a way he hadn't before. They laughed, shared stories, and as the night wore on, Daniel felt the weight of the past few months slowly lifting. For the first time in a long time, he wasn't just surviving, he was living. The conversation turned to relationships, and Frank raised an eyebrow, giving Daniel a knowing look. "So, any thoughts on dating again anytime soon?" Daniel chuckled, though it was a bit dry. He had thought about it, but not in any serious way. The idea of opening himself up to someone again seemed both impossible and terrifying. "Not yet," he said, shaking his head. "I think I've got some more growing to do. But who knows? Maybe one day." Frank smiled, raising his glass. "One day, my friend. You'll get there when you're ready." The next few months passed, and Daniel began to settle into his new life. The healing process wasn't linear, but he was moving forward, one step at a time. He knew there would be more challenges ahead, he would face heartbreak, disappointment, and pain again. But he also knew he was stronger now. He had survived the storm. And he had learned that even in the darkest times, there was always the possibility of new beginnings. He had the power to create a life that was his own. One evening, as he sat in his apartment, looking out at the skyline, Daniel felt a strange peace. He didn't know what the future held, but for the first time in a long time, he was excited to find out. And that's the story of Daniel's journey to healing and self-discovery. If you've ever experienced betrayal or heartbreak, know that you are not alone. Everyone has their own path to walk, and even in the darkest moments, there's always hope for a brighter future. Please share your experiences in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more stories that touch the heart and inspire change. Until next time, stay strong and keep moving forward.